All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Path to Zero, a primer on net zero codes. My name is Katie Kaluzny. I'm the Associate Director at the Illinois Green Alliance, and we're really excited to have you here with us on the webinar today. I want to let you know that we are recording today's webinar and sharing the recording in a follow-up email later this week. You've all been muted, but please type your questions you have into the Q&A. At the end of the discussion, we'll have time for Q&A, ample time, and you will have answers that will come up along the way. Today's webinar is being hosted by the Illinois Green Alliance's Programs Committee. Illinois Green has a group of volunteers that coordinates discussions and topics like this. And actually we have our call for new committee members coming out in the next week or so. So take a look if you would like planning fun programs like these. A little bit about the Illinois Green Alliance. We are a membership-driven nonprofit organization that advances green building and sustainable communities for all. We accomplish our mission by putting on programs such as educational events and panels and tours, engaging community and partner organizations across Illinois, and by advocating for new policies and legislation. We are currently developing a lot more web-based programs to engage our network like this. After today, our next program is this Thursday, on the 17th, a LEED Gold and Solar case study. And then on September 30th, we have another program called Energy Efficiency in the Cannabis Industry. And we have many more coming up in October, November, and December as well. So take a look at our events calendar to check out what we have going on. Today, we have a number of really great presenters to talk with us about codes. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Elnecave, to take us through the first section, and our speakers will follow one after another. As I mentioned, we'll have time for Q&A at the end, so definitely put your Q&A in throughout as you come up with questions, and we'll make sure to address them later on. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists today. Our first panelist and moderator is Elnecave. He's with the Passive House Institute US and also Illinois Green Alliance's Programs Committee. Isaac joined the Phius certification team in 2019, where he provides design review and energy modeling services to evaluate project qualifications for Phius certification. Isaac works closely with the submitting of CPHC to provide feedback on questions pertaining to energy modeling and building plans. Prior to joining Phius, Isaac worked as a policy manager focused on promoting the development, adoption, and implementation of the latest building energy codes and appliance efficiency standards. Next, we have Lisa White with Passive House Institute US. Lisa serves as Associate Director at Phius and has been there for 8 years. During her time at Phius, she's managed the building certification program, worked on technical research and standards development, and taught Phius professional training programs. Our next speaker is Vincent Martinez with Architecture 2030. Through his 13-year tenure at Architecture 2030, Vincent has been working to solve the climate crisis by catalyzing global building decarbonization efforts through the development and activation of robust networks focused on private sector commitments, education, training, and public policies. Vincent also helps set the organization's vision and currently leads Architecture 2030's work on urban zero net carbon buildings and public policy, including the Zero Code, Achieving Zero Framework, and Zero Cities Project with 11 leading US cities. Our final presenter is Leonard Sciarra with the IECC 2021 Working Group. Len is an at-large architect working currently on several net zero projects and developing a searchable, sustainable material building database. A longtime member of AIA Committee on the Environment and ASHRAE, he has been involved in building energy codes, material toxicity, and the interface of design and energy use. A supporter of early energy modeling, he feels that design on both the city and product level can address the many issues related to climate change. So with that, on our great panelists, I'm going to turn it over to Isaac to get us started and set the stage for our presentation today. Isaac, take it away and let me know when you need next slide.
Thank you, Katie. I'm going to spend really only about 5 minutes just kind of establishing what building energy codes are, just to set the stage for the next presenters. So first question, of course, is as always, is what a building energy code is. And if you look at the Department of Energy Building Energy Codes website, you'll notice that it's the set of instructions, the codes establishes the criteria for a building's thermal envelope, which is really the insulation system and the air tightness, heating, ventilation, air conditioning system. It's often defined as the worst building that you can legally build. And that's important because if we ever get to as we get to a net zero code, that would mean that a net zero building is the minimum you would end up with. Next slide. So what buildings are covered by the code? This is important. It covers residential buildings, 1 and 2 story. It covers multifamily dwellings, and it covers commercial buildings. It does not generally cover industrial, but it does cover this range of buildings. And it's important because there are codes the codes differ slightly for each of these type of buildings. Next slide. So who makes up the code? The codes is generally developed by 2 basic organizations, the International Code Council and ASHRAE. They update their codes every 3 years. The IECC, the International Code Council, develops the International Energy Conservation Code, the IECC. It's currently at the 2018, although the next version, the 2021, will be coming up very soon. And ASHRAE develops 2 standards, which are also function as codes, standard 90.1 for commercial buildings and 90.2 for residential buildings. These are both private organizations, and they develop what's called a model code. These are not enforceable. They become enforceable typically when a state adopts the code, either legislatively in the case of a state like Nebraska, or administratively in the case of most every other state. Typically, the states will adopt one or both of these standards. This applies to about 43 of the states. There's about 7 states that do not adopt the code statewide. These are called home rule states. They include states such as Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Missouri, Mississippi, and Kansas. In this case, local jurisdictions have the ability to adopt their own code. Finally, once a state adopts a code, typically a local municipality, the local municipalities are who enforce the state code. Next. Stretch codes, as implied, is basically a code that's more efficient than the model code. As I've noted, some states, so there's 3 possibilities here. Some states do not allow jurisdictions to adopt a stretch code. Some states, even though they have a statewide code, allow municipalities to adopt one, including states like Massachusetts, New York, and Washington. Importantly, Massachusetts and New York have codes that have developed a statewide effectively stretch code. Otherwise, municipalities are kind of on their own. Home rule states can just have municipalities within them adopt their own code. Some municipalities with stretch codes include Seattle, who have a commercial only stretch code, Denver, Austin, and Boulder. Next slide. And finally, I want to end with basically a definition for a net zero building. I want to caveat this by stating very clearly that the definition of a net zero building is still under discussion, and there is a lot of it. There are a number of organizations, including ASHRAE, who are working to develop a kind of a standard definition. However, for the purposes of this webinar, I felt it was important to have something upon which to pin our discussion on. So one generally fairly standard definition is basically, a net zero building is a building where the energy produced by renewable energy, both on-site and off-site, exceeds the energy consumed by the building. And with that, I would like to get into the much more deeper discussion on what net zero codes are, and I'd like to introduce Associate Director of Phius, Lisa White.
Thank you for unmuting me. All right, so thank you, Isaac, for turning that over and for setting some groundwork. As Isaac said, I'm with Phius. I'm going to talk about the path to zero, kind of in a residential framework or context, but really these passive building principles apply to all building types. Okay, it's a bit of a lag here. So again, I'm going to be talking about building a net zero code with kind of a passive building baseline, or kind of a passive building framework, and what we've done at Phius. So I guess I should maybe take a step back. Phius does not have mandatory code language or mandatory program. It's a voluntary program, but we have a set of standard that we believe is a nice baseline standard on the path to zero. So kind of the hierarchy when you're building a net zero code is, okay, first we want to make sure the building is a quality building, it's healthy, it's durable. You know, the whole reason for codes, of course, is to create a good building, right? And then the next step, at least from Phius's perspective, is to use passive conservation strategies. And these passive conservation strategies are mostly good at reducing space conditioning loads in buildings. After that, after you reduce loads in the building, you use active conservation strategies such as equipment efficiencies to reduce the amount of energy it takes to meet a load, as well as high performance equipment, things like that. Once you've done all you can there, that's kind of your conservation package. Then you can turn to renewable energy. Say Phius generally prioritizes on-site renewable energy and then off-site renewable energy. And that's kind of your hierarchy for getting to net zero. And again, we're talking about annual net zero. That is how Phius looks at it. Like Isaac said, you can get into a whole can of worms with defining net zero, and timing is really important. So I guess I won't go much further than that. So if we're starting with a quality building, if you're thinking about a residential net energy code, net zero code, you need to build upon the best practices programs first. So you need to lay a baseline that ensures that best practice is being followed, because there are things more important than, or things that don't show up in kilowatt hours, don't show up in an energy model, don't show up in that net energy accounting, but are still really important for a quality building, like air quality, building durability, things like that. So Phius Plus is the standard I'm going to be talking about, is kind of the baseline for Phius Plus Source Zero, which is our zero standard. And Phius Plus is built upon these kind of nationally recognized programs of best practices. So you've got codes, Energy Star, Zero Energy Ready Home, and there's a few more. So kind of starting, laying the groundwork with nationally recognized programs for quality. The next thing to do is apply the passive building principles to conserve energy. So we have thermal control, radiation control, and air control. And these are delivered in different ways. So thermal control, continuous insulation, reducing thermal bridging, or when there is thermal bridging, appropriately calculating it and taking it into account in the energy balance. Radiation control is really optimizing window and solar gain. So it's not passive solar. I want to make that very clear. It's not tons of mass and glass. It's optimizing solar gain so that you have solar radiation when you want it, and do not when you don't. Like a warm summer day, you'd like to block that, and you might want to allow more in the winter. Airtight construction. So the air control is a combination of two things. Really airtight construction. This is really mostly based on building durability. As air travels through a building envelope, it carries moisture with it. It makes the building more vulnerable to deterioration or rot over time, or mold, or things like that. So sealing up that envelope, and then because you seal up that building envelope, now you need to deliver balanced ventilation. And to keep the loads down, you want heat recovery in almost all climates in the US, probably arguably all of them. So those kind of are a package. You don't want to do one without the, oh, you could do balanced ventilation without airtight, but you don't want to do airtight construction without balanced ventilation. So those are a package. And I'll point out a little bit later, this is one of the places where Phius is really pushing a lot further than codes right now, but the other ones aren't too far off. And then as a kind of product of applying these passive building principles, you then get into this active, minimized, efficient mechanical system. So active conservation strategies of reducing the amount of energy it takes to meet a lower load. So what Phius did to develop the point in investment in passive building strategies is use an optimization tool called BOPT, and ran a bunch of simulations looking at total cost versus source energy savings. And the total cost is upfront costs to improve the building envelope. So to invest in those passive building strategies, whether it's insulation, better windows, better ventilation, heat recovery, things like that. So there's a bunch of different packages, and those cost more upfront, right? But then they also save on energy. So what we did is we gave this building optimization tool a lot of different packages of upgrades. And you can see each of these in this plot up here is each of these dots is the result of total cost versus total source energy savings. So each of these is a different simulation. And this black line along the bottom is kind of the optimal path where you save the most energy for the least amount of cost overall. So what we did is we looked at those simulations and we picked the point that saved the most energy for the least amount of cost. And it's the point kind of at the bottom of the curve. And you can see if you can keep saving, but it's going to eventually cost more and more and more. Right, so we try to pick that optimal point. And this is kind of, this chart at the bottom is kind of what it shows that baseline building. This is all relative to a Building America benchmark. The baseline building versus the passive building where that landed. And we took those points where that building landed and set performance targets for heating and cooling loads based on how that building performed. So there's two caveats. One is we constrained windows based on comfort. So like I was saying, there are things that are important to buildings other than kilowatt hours and kilowatt hour savings, something like comfort, air quality, things like that. And then we also constrained air tightness to be based on Phius's target, which is based on separate research related to building envelope durability. So we said comfort really wasn't subject to economic optimization, and air tightness wasn't as well. That has a separate metric, not based on cost. Otherwise, we took those study buildings, and we developed this performance calculator that scales based on climate, building size, which is this ratio of floor area to envelope area, and then also occupant density, because that can change loads in a building. So with that whole optimization study, we developed these targets, which are really passive building principle targets. They're all conservation targets based on strictly utilizing passive building principles. It's nothing to do with lighting, it has nothing to do with the equipment efficiencies or any of that. These are specifically loads for the building itself based on how those passive principles were designed or were implemented. So the next step is the active efficiencies, which I'm calling active versus passive. So these are the equipment efficiencies, getting better HSPF for your heat pump or something, getting Energy Star appliances, things like that. So we lean on these other programs to kind of set the guardrails for that equipment. So you have to stay within, or I guess exceed minimum requirements for these programs for all other equipment and appliance and lighting and all of that efficiency within the building. So in terms of the way Phius looks at this, there's kind of two different goals here. There's one where you take the baseline building and you apply the passive building principles to meet those specific performance targets, and that's the Phius Plus core. So that is take the building, the continuous insulation, optimize solar gain, air tightness, balance ventilation with heat recovery, and the minimized mechanical systems. After you get to that conservation point, you then can utilize a combination of on-site or off-site renewable energy. I won't get into the weeds with the details there, but we've essentially aligned with ASHRAE 189.1. I think it's Appendix J, but there's different accounting for the different renewable energy resources. On-site's favored the most, and something like a renewable energy certificate is favored the least. There's different offsetting factors for different types that you use. But the concept is the same. Baseline building, apply the passive conservation strategies, apply the active conservation strategies, and use renewable energy to meet whatever is left, whatever load is left. So Vincent Martinez will be talking about the zero code. I'm not going to steal thunder here, but really the concept is the exact same. So design an energy efficient building and address the remaining needs with on-site and off-site renewable energy. Really the only difference is Phius is saying use Phius Plus core as your efficiency target, whereas I'll let Vincent talk about the efficiency target for Architecture 2030. But in principle, they really align. Another way we've seen that it really aligns with meeting the Architecture 2030 goals, is this recent article from the Chicago Architect magazine, which showed that one firm in Chicago, Tom Bessadilli Architects, actually met their 2030 reduction goals, and it was the one firm in Chicago that did this. And Tom Bessadilli Architect is committed to doing all passive building projects. So there's really good alignment with going to the Phius Plus standard for your buildings and meeting that 2030 goal. So we're really kind of charting toward the same goal overall, just a slightly different path. Okay, so you might wonder, like, what does that look like? Just to give you some numbers in terms of performance. So this orange stuff at the top, the orange boxes are the passive strategies. Then we get into the active efficiencies, and we'll look at the EUI. So I compared this versus what I believe is what IECC 2021 will be. Len, I probably could have reached out to you to get make sure these numbers are right, but I took a building in Chicago and compared the two different packages. So you can see the walls are pretty different. We got like R18 for 2021 and we got like 35 for Phius Plus. Roof the same. Slab, you're going to see a difference. Most of the Phius Plus performance targets are requiring whole slab insulation. Window U value, as I chart down here, 0.28 versus 0.16 is a pretty big jump. The window, I don't know if you would need quite this low in Chicago for comfort, but it's pretty close to that. Or you could maybe exceed that. So this is one thing about this package. This is one option that would work for Phius Plus. There's always multiple options because it's a performance-based standard. There's trade-offs at least within these orange, within the passive strategies, there's trade-offs. So these are the windows I selected, same glass, just to keep it consistent. And the air tightness infiltration is like 4 times tighter almost for the Phius Plus building. So an ACH 50, 0.87 versus the 3. But really Phius's air tightness targets a per square foot limit. So that's just the equivalent ACH 50 there. And then again, that's one of the big points. And then the other is the ventilation strategy. So the Phius building had balanced ventilation, 75% heat recovery, whereas the IECC 2021 had exhaust only, bath fans, kitchen fans. And then the equipment, the Phius building needed to be a little bit better than the IECC 2021 because of zero energy ready home mandates for equipment efficiencies. It's not incredible, not unheard of efficiencies there. These are both all electric buildings. So then the water heaters are electric, heat pump water heater for the Phius building, just electric storage tank for the code. Appliances, I kept the same. Lighting, I kept the same. And what we see here is that the IECC 2021 is roughly 21.5 in terms of a site EUI, that's kBTU per foot squared per year, and the Phius building is 16.4. So you're still seeing quite a bit of savings. And what that looks like in terms of where that savings is coming from, if you remember, I said the miscellaneous loads are the same. We're assuming they're plugging the same stuff in. The lighting, I kept the same. I did not say the passive building had more efficient lighting. Same with appliances. So these first 3 aren't any different. And that's kind of occupant dependent stuff, but also the appliances are an Energy Star. I gave the IECC 2021 Energy Star appliances as well. So where we get into differences, the ventilation fan is a little higher for the passive building. It's running continuously at a higher rate than the intermittent exhaust fans. The hot water was more efficient, the heat pump water heater than the electric water heater. But really what you're getting into, the differences here are space cooling, pretty similar between the two. It's just really crushing the space heating with the reduced infiltration, and probably that and the better windows is really where most of that load is coming from, the difference between the two. The slab probably had a little bit to do with it as well. But you can see just by pushing a little bit further, we actually get a 24% reduction from the original building by pushing a little bit further, sealing it up, and doing the balanced ventilation. So there's still, in my opinion, savings to be had pushing past that. If you're going to go to 0, push past the code level. And then everyone, the question is, does it cost more? So just threw in one example of successes we've seen in affordable housing. So this is affordable housing, not just market rate housing, affordable housing. So in 2015, the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency wrote passive building certification into their low-income housing tax credit application. So they give points to people that are designing to passive house and certifying. So in the first year, they collect all the cost data, the finance agency, and the passive building projects came in plus 2% in upfront costs versus the other buildings. It's like, okay, yeah, it costs a little bit more, it costs 2% more. In 2016, same thing, except it came in 2% lower The passive buildings are actually 2% less in upfront cost versus the other buildings. This doesn't include ongoing operational costs. This is just upfront cost. And then they saw the exact same thing in 2018. So it can cost less. It's more about getting past the learning curve. And so yeah, first timers doing it, pilot projects, things like that in 2015 generally tend to cost more expensive. But as people learned and as people started to optimize their processes and design, the cost came down. And this is upfront cost savings and operational savings, you know, really make this significantly greater. So this success has sparked additional states, 15 additional states right now, to include passive building in their low-income housing tax credit applications, and 16 more are in process right now. So again, this isn't just housing, this is affordable housing, people that are very careful and particular about how to spend the money up front as it should be, and they're writing in passive building as part of their programs. So one last thing to end on is just a couple case study examples, just pretty pictures of Phius Plus Source Zero certified projects. So I didn't really get into the source. Maybe I have a minute to do that. So Phius looks at everything on a source energy basis rather than a site. So our zero certification is also based on source, but 1 kilowatt hour generated on site offsets whatever the source energy factor for electricity is at the source. So right now that's 2.8. That'll drop down, and right now gas is natural gas and combustion is allowed, but Phius 2021, which will be released in 3 months or so, the Phius Plus Source Zero certification will not allow combustion. So we are going the electrification route for the zero standard, potentially not the core, which is, I showed you those 2 levels, but for the zero standard, we are going to all electric. And there's roughly, what's this, 70 Phius Plus projects that are either in the certification process, pre-certified, which means they're designed and need to be built, and 28 certified to the Phius Plus Source Zero standard, which we released in 2015. Okay, and with that, I will turn it over to Vincent Martinez with Architecture 2030.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you very much to Isaac and Katie for inviting me to present to this group today. I'm going to talk about how we developed the Zero Code and where it's at right now, but it's really a strategy for decarbonization policy for new construction. If you haven't been aware of this statistic, over the next 4 decades, we're expecting to build 2.4 trillion square feet across the globe. It's essentially doubling the current global building stock over the next 4 decades. Everything we've built since the dawn of time, we're building again in 40 years. So it's, and most of this construction is expected to take place in urban areas. So it's absolutely critical from a climate change perspective, where we need to be peaking emissions now and reducing emissions annually by 50 to 65% in the next 10 years. If you've heard, this is the most critical decade for us to have zero codes adopted immediately before all of this new construction takes place and starts to add to the emissions issue. Now, zero emissions in new construction will require 3 things. And this is not unsimilar to what Lisa just presented. Certainly, we want that new construction to come in as efficient as possible. And we have latest model building codes or voluntary standards like Phius in order to provide us with the energy efficiency requirements of that new construction. In addition, Lisa mentioned electrification. We need to ensure that all these new buildings that we're going to be adding to the building stock over the next 40 years don't add additional fossil fuels on site. So this is in line with that no combustion electrification movement that's been going on. And then thirdly, we have to make sure that the energy, the electricity that these buildings will use comes from carbon-free renewable energy sources. That's that on and off-site renewable energy that Lisa mentioned. And this is really the core focus of the Zero Code Renewable Energy Standard. So in 2018, Architecture 2030 embarked with internationally recognized code expert Charles Ely to develop the Zero Code, which is a national and international energy conservation standard, not produced through a typical pathway that Isaac let out from ASHRAE or IECC, but just to put a flag out there in front about what would be required in a codes and standards world in order to add on renewable electricity. And it really is doing a particular thing. It's focusing on the larger commercial buildings and multi-family buildings that are suspect to the commercial code. So this is the non-residential, not the area of residential that Lisa was talking about, because this is the predominant type of construction being built across the globe today. And the zero code does two things. It essentially requires that all new buildings bring on their own carbon-free renewable energy systems with them. So they're highly efficient, and then they make sure that their energy is coming from renewable sources. And it wants to ensure as best as possible that that new renewable energy is additional to the grid, that it is not necessarily just trading around existing wind credits or something like that that's already in the market, but we're actually moving the grid into a cleaner fashion more quickly through the demand of the building sector. So how do we meet the zero code? And Lisa showed one of our old graphics, but essentially the key is you design a building to be meeting the latest national model codes. After that, you determine how much renewables you need to either generate or procure, and you do that either through a prescriptive pathway, there's a table in the zero code standard, or through the performance pathway in which you've done a model and simulation, and it tells you the energy consumption of the building, and that is your renewables that you're required to generate or procure. And then again, you generate or procure those either through on-site renewable energy sources like on-site PV, or you procure it through contract from the utility or a third-party provider. And I'll explain a little bit more about these. Now, the zero code pretty much is all about how do we understand offsite procurement. There's a variety of offsite procurement mechanisms, and we have certain requirements to make sure that those are valid and we're getting the benefits that we want out of that new renewable contract. So we need a contract, number one. It needs to have a legally binding contract with the building. We set the duration is not less than 15 years and she'll survive the transfer if that property is sold. This is actually a really critical item here. And 15 years is a typical power purchase agreement length, so that's why we chose that. The renewable energy credits and other environmental attributes have to stay with the building during the contract. This is not about you installing photovoltaics on your property and then selling the renewable energy attributes off to help that pencil. This is about making sure that each individual building keeps its own renewable energy credits, and that the renewables we determine should come from non-carbon emitting sources, photovoltaics, solar thermal power plants, geothermal power plants, or wind turbines. And that the renewables should be generated within the electricity grid, the ISO or the RTO. So this should be local renewables. This shouldn't be about purchasing something from the other side of the country or a renewable energy credit from the other side of the world. This is about accelerating the clean energy grid locally. And then we need to make sure there's a transparent accounting to make sure that the building is the one that's actually procuring that renewables and it's not set up to a corporation or a third party. So in our evaluation, we found there's many different types of renewable energy procurement, but not all of them are necessarily created equal at a global scale. And so it was important for us in the development of the zero code to come up with some sort of procurement methodology in order to weight those different procurement methods based off the risk. So we created a class structure. We said that there are about 4 different kinds of procurement methods that we think are class 1. They have a high probability of keeping their durability, meaning that they won't be able to be stopped partway through the contract or sold or traded when a building is sold. And then also that they are producing what we call additionality or additional impact, meaning that they wouldn't have normally been added onto the grid under a normal circumstance, that this is incentivizing the development of those new renewables. And they're listed as such: virtual power purchase agreements, which are very common among large corporations; direct ownership, if you had a campus or a portfolio or you owned other property and you wanted to install the solar there; community renewables, which is a nice way of procuring it through a local utility, but you maybe don't have the site space for it; and then a new concept which we developed called a renewable energy investment fund. And the idea here is very similar to affordable housing policy, where instead of a developer installing a certain number of affordable units in the development, that they actually pay into a fund, and then the municipality or the jurisdiction then builds the affordable housing on their behalf somewhere else. Same concept here for renewable energy. The developer can pay into a fund for the renewables if they don't want to either develop renewables on their building site or procure it from the utility, that they would then pay into this fund, and the jurisdiction can then work with a third party to develop renewables on their behalf. We think these have a high probability of additionality. The transaction is very clear, and we know where the sources are coming from. And so we have a discount factor which is a factor that it basically devalues the total amount of generation or procurement from what would be on-site. So on-site would be factor of 1. If you followed any of these, it would be discounted by 0.75. And so you'd have to buy more of these types of contracts than if you were to just procure it or generate it on site. We also recognize in some locations that other types of community renewables are available through a subscription, or you can access to the wholesale market, as well as green tariffs, which are typically your green power programs at a utility. The issue with many of these is that you can unsubscribe. So just as quickly as you could subscribe 1 month or 2 months, you can unsubscribe in the next month. So it doesn't have a strong of a durability, but it does still have a medium probability of additionality. So we've then weighted these a little bit differently and said we're going to weight these at a 0.55 discount factor. And this is again at a global scale. So something locally in Illinois or in Chicago might be very different depending on the community renewables or the utility structures for their green retail tariffs. And in that case, you might want to modify the discount factor and increase its applicability. And then finally, because this is a global standard, and again, we're building globally, but not all utility grids or have the ability to either install on-site renewables or have generation. And so we have to recognize that there are unbundled renewable energy credits, which might be appropriate in certain locations around the world, but those have low probabilities of additionality in many cases because they're sold already and already produced. And they're typically undervalued. And so we wanted to make sure that those were recognized as having that lower probability. And so the discount factor is even lower for those. Again, this is set up as a default framework across the globe, recognizing that we're going to be building across the globe. Local jurisdictions are taking this framework and they're modifying it to meet their local needs. And so this is the equation. It essentially says that on-site is created equal. So if you do renewables, it equals the amount of energy that you're consuming. If you're purchasing it from off-site, you have to apply these discount factors. And again, you can modify those. The offsite procurement methodologies are all outlined in a technical support document for the Zero Code, which is available on the website at zero-code.org. It includes a review of all of these different procurement methods, which I mentioned very briefly here, but it also provides a comparison and classification methodology for a local jurisdiction to evaluate what's available locally and how you might want to adjust that following a set of criteria and a process for weighting and creating your own procurement factors. So we fully expect that different jurisdictions will assign different weighting factors for the different offsite procurement methods, and that the Zero Code provides a general flexible approach and a framework for Zero Code development. So these are some things that you might consider when you're looking at requiring offsite procurement. Additionality, are we getting new renewables to the grid? Durability, is there a long-term commitment? Can you assign it to the building? How does it affect the grid management capability? You'll hear about things like grid optimization and making sure we can manage our interplay with the grid. Environmental impacts might be important in your local jurisdiction and ensure that new renewables aren't built in greenfields, for example. You might have an inspiration or an educational value that you want those renewables to be local and visible. And then some power purchase agreements have to have a large credit rating, and you have to have a large amount of procurement. And so incremental acquisition might be something that you would consider, like community renewables, as one option in order to aggregate that. And then financing might be another consideration. These are all to say is there's quite a bit of complexity and a whole world around renewable energy procurement. So as much as simple as it is for us to start to understand energy efficiency, on-site renewable generation, procurement is a whole different animal. And so this provides a framework for understanding it and regulating it. Now, I should note that every Zero Code across the world that's being developed will have those 3 components that I mentioned earlier. And we're starting to see a lot of movement in this direction. In terms of energy efficiency, we heard about ASHRAE. We'll hear more about from the ASHRAE standard from Len, and increasing the energy efficiency capabilities. We know California has Title 24 as their energy efficiency standard, which ratchets up. We know that the latest IECC has a market improvement over the last IECC. And then we also know that Zero Codes are being pushed from an energy efficiency perspective in Europe through the EU directive. And also in China, there's a nearly net zero with on and off-site renewables that are pushing the boundary on energy efficiency as well as requiring renewables. So we're making progress on efficiency. There's a lot more way to go. I think Len's going to talk about how do we get to max tech on that. Electrification, we're starting to see actually not happen directly in codes, but actually in ordinances and gas bans for new construction. Berkeley started this earlier last year, and it's now in California in 33 different jurisdictions, and we're seeing movement in the Northeast as well. So this is not North American specific. We're seeing this all over Europe about requiring new construction to ban combustion or our fossil fuels on site. So this is a global movement that is starting to take off in order to ensure that, again, those new buildings are not adding to our emissions issue by having on-site fossil fuels. And then finally, it's not just the zero code. I mentioned the EU directive. The EU directive also requires on and off-site renewables. They could say on-site or nearby renewables, and they have different terminology for their procurement. And then the China standard also requires on and off-site renewables. So this is not a North American phenomenon. This is happening across the world in order to get at that 2.4 trillion square feet of new construction we're slated to build over the next 4 decades. I should mention that the American Institute of Architects took the Zero Code, the Architecture 2030, and Charles Ely developed in 2018, submitted it for the 2021 IECC code process last year. It was submitted as a voluntary appendix and passed as submitted. When the IECC is released later in the fall of this year, we hope that it will be available for local jurisdictions to adopt as they see fit via the appendix. And once they adopt the zero code, then it becomes a requirement for those in that jurisdiction to bring on their own renewables. Again, their default values, the whole methodology I've gone over here on the procurement methods can be modified as seen fit by the local jurisdiction. And there are a host of local jurisdictions already looking at the 2021 IECC Renewable Energy Appendix as part of their mandates to get to zero codes or net zero standards. So I'm going to end with just a few key points. The IECC 2021 Zero Code Renewable Energy Appendix will be optional for jurisdictions to adopt because it is an appendix. It can actually be used under any version of the I-code. So if you have a previous version, the 2018 IECC, for example, they can still adopt the 2021 appendix and apply it and add the renewables to their existing energy efficiency standards. So that's something that's interesting to note. You are required to comply with the IECC 2021 before you apply any renewable energy. They cannot be traded off, and the renewable energy requirements are on top of any minimum energy efficiency requirements. The renewable energy requirements, as I mentioned earlier, are set either prescriptively through the table, or if you follow the performance path, they're determined from the energy simulation. And we also provide incentives in this structure in order for folks to move with beyond code efficiency. And the reason for that is because those renewables will cost something to the building owner. And so they are incentivized to follow the performance pathway rather than using the prescriptive number from the standard in order to reduce their loads and increase their energy efficiency so they procure less renewables. We also encourage on-site renewable energy generation when feasible, and that has to do with that procurement factor. Again, on-site renewables are weighted at a procurement factor of 1, whereas all off-site are rated below 1, meaning that they're incentivizing on-site generation. But it does offer many varieties of off-site procurement because we know that that's necessary for these mid-rise and high-rise buildings that are built in urban areas where they won't have access necessarily to all of the solar radiation for on-site PV, but also they're high energy users like hospitals, laboratories, and fast food restaurants, which will all have high loads and would not be able to generate it all on site in a typical fashion. And again, we think that the Zero Code provides a consistent framework that governments can use and adopt and modify for their specific needs. Again, this was originally an Architecture 2030 development in 2018, supported by the American Institute of Architects to submit to the IECC process, and now included as a standard in the IECC 2021 when it will be published. I should also note that there's a lot of movement, again, not just from local jurisdictions, but also the federal governments. The House Select Committee on Climate Action mentioned the Zero Code Renewable Energy Appendix multiple times. They can't require local jurisdictions to adopt it, but they can tie it to funding, and they have it in their plan that they want to see the Zero Code adopted in all jurisdictions across the country by 2030 and incentivizing it before then. So this is a movement that is happening not just in North America. As I mentioned, there's the European directive, and there's also the China standard as well. So I hope this has been a great overview for you on how the commercial Zero Code was developed and its current status. And with that, I will pass it over to Len, and he's going to tell us how we can drive efficiency even further, I believe, and the ASHRAE approach to net zero.
Okay, well, Katie does a slide switch. So yeah, my name is Len Sciarra, and actually the tagline should be I'm part of the ASHRAE 90.1 committee, not the IECC working group. So next, let me go. Boom. Yeah, so thanks, Vincent, for a great summary of the complexities with purchasing renewables. Hang on, Katie, it should advance. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, just so the two codes that we've been talking about, 90.1 and the IECC, they are sort of have this symbiotic relationship, and they both are on a 3-year cycle, and they both, you know, they both deal with this sort of minimum building you have to build. And ASHRAE and the IECC work together. So as municipalities adopt the I codes, they adopt 90.1 by reference, because market share wise, the I codes are adopted in way more jurisdictions. So it's to the benefit of ASHRAE to be included within that adoption cycle to give people the option. And for some building types, 90.1 is perfectly appropriate. For some building types, the IECC is appropriate. But it's important that there is a floor for all of the other regulatory structures that sit on top of these codes. And so the benefit of having a robust code structure is that tax incentives, utility incentives, other contracts can be written on something that can be built upon. And so the importance of having a robust code structure, you know, within sort of the framework can't be underestimated. The thing about the codes, and this slide looks really familiar to Lisa's slide, right? I mean, we've all done the same thing. 90.1 does the same thing. We look at the cost of energy, we look at the cost of an energy efficiency measure, and we find the optimum. I mean, the basic, the one I always like to use is the first inch of insulation saves you a lot of energy. So that would be, you know, high up on the left, and then each additional inch of insulation costs, you know, more money, but it saves you less and less energy. And so we find the optimum. That's what 90.1 does. The I codes do the same thing similarly, but there is more of a voting process. But in general, both codes strive to develop something that the majority of the industry, the majority of the country can adopt, states can adopt, because it's not going too far and it's not going too bad. They're trying to like strike this balance in the middle between advocacy and industry. So historically, they've done a pretty good job. If you look at where we were started in 1975, I mean, this is sort of a chart of national energy use. And you know, we've probably cut the energy use of a typical building by 50% or more in the last, well, now it's about 50 years. But as we all know, life is changing more rapidly than I think the code structure can change. And so we need to start thinking outside the box and do some other stuff. This was just a little map of most of the states have adopted some form of an energy code. The deep green states have are on the most recent cycle. This is a 90.1 cycle, but if you remember the 3-year code cycle, so the far left, that little 5 number is a 2016. That would be equivalent to a IECC 2018. And I just found out this morning that Nebraska, that little state in the middle, is also deep green. They just adopted the 2018, as well as Delaware and Vermont, they just adopted statewide code. So this is another chart of that. It's sort of a similar chart to the one I showed, just looking at the overall energy use, looking at what can individual systems do. Because once we sort of look at the whole building, we realize we've got to get to zero. You know, 90.1 and the IECC start to look at systems and individual systems. And so how far can we push individual systems to go down? And you can see this trajectory. We're trying to get to zero. You know, if we just do the business as usual, we're probably not going to make it. So we're all looking really hard to figure out, like, what can we do within systems? Because these systems actually represent pieces of equipment that have to be built and have to be made. And if the piece of equipment can't be made, then it doesn't matter what your target is. You just can never get there. And heating is a great example. Like right now, heating is based on a furnace. Well, a furnace can't really get that much more efficient. I mean, it's like 98% efficient. You can do some heat recovery, but in general, if you do fossil heating, you're never gonna, you just can't get there, right? So we have to start thinking of other things. Lighting, obviously lighting, LEDs, chillers are going down. We can always add more insulation, but we hit that cost curve. So this is the thing that we're struggling with, right? Like, what is this? How do we get this down? And like this, when we say this vector, we can maybe get to some level, but at some point, we're never going to be able to, you know, we're always going to have to get energy from offsite. And that gets into that whole discussion of electrification and offsite. So knowing, ASHRAE and the IECC kind of realizing this, you know that with the prescriptive code process, they're never going to get to zero. They sort of have developed, there's a advanced energy design guides for net zero buildings. The New Buildings Institute has put out some information on net zero buildings. So there's sort of other, not codes, but other guidebooks and documents that can help designers get to these low energy buildings. And then of course we talked about the zero code, another way of getting to the low energy buildings. So to go back to the code world and Max Tech, and to get you guys a feeling for how far you could possibly push a building while being cost effective, you know, we started to look at the one big thing is the chiller efficiency. And so we're sort of running into, we can't make chillers much more efficient. And so we sort of are bottoming out at this code cycle and realizing that, you know, we can make buildings more efficient on the envelope side. Lighting is pretty much hit what it has with LEDs. You can do a little bit more with lighting and lighting controls. And then you can do some more with chillers and refrigerants, but we're also, the really efficient refrigerants are also really toxic. And so, you know, we're starting to look at like what other non-toxic refrigerants can we use and can we use safely? So there was a good report put out by this guy named Jason Glazer, who actually is has a firm out in Morton Grove. He's an energy modeler, and he looked at like what we call, and Vincent was talking about Max Tech. Like, what can we possibly, if we took everything off, everything that's currently on the shelf, and this was done in 2017, so 2018, so it's a little outdated, but not too much. You know, technology hasn't changed that much. To figure out how far can we bring, you know, a code compliant building down. And you can see, these are the standard breakdowns that we use in 90.1 that represent most of the building stock in North America. And obviously, probably, I don't know if you can read the numbers, but the darker numbers are more savings. And this is a savings from a 2013 building. And the numbers don't mean a lot except for magnitude. So this slide is what we call the EUI. We talked about the EUI as being the sort of the amount of energy that your building uses as a way to compare. It's a you know, kBTUs per square foot per year, and then it gives you a way to compare a building A to building B. So these are site energy intensities, and you can see sort of the Max Tech, just like a medium office building in Chicago, where Chicago would be like 12, right? So if you threw everything you could, and we haven't figured out how to make this cost effective, but if you threw everything you could at a small office building in Chicago, you'd have an EUI of 12, and then Vincent, you'd have to calculate how many renewables that would be. You could either put that on or off, and that's what you would have to buy or put on your building. And so these have EUIs for various building types, and you know, and then we also pointed out high-rise office buildings don't have as much surface area to do on-site renewables, and so they're going to have to go off-site versus strip malls or retail buildings, as if they keep getting built, you know, have a lot more roof area. So, but these numbers are important because this is sort of, if you're talking to somebody and say, hey, what's your energy use intensity? These are the numbers that if you were familiar with, you could start to get really savvy about how far you need to go to get further. So as a perspective, the last code cycle of 90.1, which is 2019, it just came out. The EUIs for these same building types are here, and you can see for medium office building is 29. So the code, as it's written, is giving you an EUI of about 30. The Max Tech if you apply it, is giving you an EUI of 12. So there's still some work to do on the code. Even if you just adopt the code, there's still some work you got to do, just to give you sort of a framework of how far the code is from sort of where you have to go before you have to buy renewables. And then just a little bit about, I think we've covered this before, on-site renewables are way more valuable than off-site renewables just because of all the transmission losses that have to happen. And so just in general, and Vincent, I think 8 to 10% is what I've been reading about in terms of transmission losses for electricity. So that's sort of the site versus source discussion that is also going to come up. And then I just saw a final picture of a project that a firm I'm working for now, Serena Storm Architects. But this is a net zero office building. It's just your basic office building out in Roselle. And they got it to net zero, and it just got built. So they're still sort of commissioning it to see how it goes. So with SC3 construction in Serena's term. And then Lisa or Katie, I think we're ready for questions, or Isaac. And we'll leave our videos on.
Yep. Thanks so much, Len. And if everyone wants to turn their video back on, I appreciate all of you guys. Folks, if you can write your questions in the Q&A or the chat, we'll look in both places. We don't care where you put it. And if you would like to raise your hand, and I can also unmute you to ask a question if it's easier for you to ask the question out loud. So 3 opportunities to share your questions. I'm going to turn it over to Isaac with a starter question, and take it away. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So I'm going to start with, there are 2 or 3 questions in the chat, so I'm going to get to those immediately after that, but I want to get a first question in, and this goes to all 3 of our panelists. My question really is how do you feel that the green building community can engage around net zero codes? How can it use its influence to move net zero codes forward? And I'm happy to start it up with whoever wants to start.
I'll start, Isaac, because I have been thinking about this. And, I think the thing that we need to do is we need to really look, because I've had this problem, and I'm in, the Republic of Evanston. You got to understand the local climate, the local political climate. And the first thing that any advocacy that we need to do, we need to understand what can happen within the local aldermanic structure or whatever, because the state can do only so much, I think. And if we can each, within our own cities or municipalities, get them to do some type of a stretch code with incentives, then it'll just happen everywhere. That's at least, and maybe that's a little because I'm in Evanston, and so there's a little bit more advocacy, but I think that getting to know the local political climate and building relationships with those city managers and aldermen is crucial.
I'm happy to go next, unless Lisa, you want to.
Good.
Okay. I think in general, you're seeing more municipalities, states, local governments developing some sort of climate action plan and having targets about reducing emissions, either completely going carbon neutral or 80 by 50 or you name it. They're having a variety of things. Net zero codes are an absolute must. They are a must have. They are not an if or when. They're not an if, it's a when this will happen in order to meet those demands. You cannot meet these heavy reduction targets without having net zero standards for new construction. Otherwise, you're just leaving that problem for existing building policies, which is not the intention. So these will be happening. I think that the building community has a lot of credibility with the code development community and the jurisdictions that have authority. And the reason for that is because these are the folks that are actually out there building and designing these buildings. They're the ones that are making this stuff happen on the ground. So they have that credibility about whether or not these standards are cost effective, and then how do we develop them and go further. And so they have a really strong advocacy role on that front and have the credibility there. I would say though, Isaac, that I think that the design community needs to get more familiar with the utility sector and what's available through procurement. A lot of the information that I shared is relatively brand new to the design community. And if we are going to actually be meeting and requiring to meet these net zero standards, we're going to have to be really familiar with offsite procurement and be very familiar with explaining it to our clients about how they either do that voluntarily now and get ahead of the game, which many are already doing, but also as these standards start to pop up, how are they going to we support our clients in this front?
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Vincent. We've just seeing at Phius starting to allow offsite renewable options. It's people don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole because of they don't know what it is. They don't want to get in a 20-year contract and things like that. So it is something that building developers and designers haven't had to deal with before, but we do understand if you get to zero, you need to go that far. So I guess from my end, I would just challenge if you're a building designer, architect, engineer out there, assess the feasibility of net zero using these paths for one building. Just try it on your next building. I'm not saying do it, just look at what it would take. Reach out to some, suppliers of renewable energy procurement, on-site, off-site, whatever, and see what it would take. And that can also just drive the industry forward. Seeing more demand from our building design team can slowly but surely move things forward and get things a little more normalized.
All right. I got about 3 or 4 questions, so I'm going to go in order. So this one I'll first send to Lisa. One questioner asked, can you please demonstrate the feasibility of designing an all-electric multifamily building in Chicago? The example is a 20-story, 300 units. What systems for space heating and domestic water heating?
Yeah, I think, Lynn, you can pitch in at any time on this one too. But so I can't say I've seen a 20-story, 300-unit all-electric building in Chicago, but what we typically see is ventilation separated from heating and cooling. So balanced ventilation, whether that's at a central scale, semi-centralized, or unit by unit, balanced ventilation with heat recovery. Heating and cooling, we typically would see VRF or hydronic. Maybe not hydronic for Chicago, but VRF for Chicago. And then the water heating will be some form of heat pump, whether it's a ground source or smaller semi-centralized heat pump water heaters with tanks that are inside. That's typically what we'd see. But Len, please feel free to add.
And also, you have to look at the orientation and the solar loads. So the thing in Chicago is a mixed climate, right? We have cold winters and we have pretty hot summers. And so you need to make sure the envelope is dealing with both of those a lot. Yeah, my daughter was in here too. In terms of the mechanical system, I'm with Lisa. You would probably separate the ventilation from the heating and cooling. And if you did the envelope right, you wouldn't need theoretically that much heating or cooling, because it's mostly solar heating, solar glare, solar heat gain that's going to kill you.
Yeah, a lot of internal gain too with a dense building like that.
So I'll ask the next question. This is from, it says, in Minnesota, the cost to power HVAC with electricity versus natural gas are substantially more. They point out that this is why construction sites will use natural propane temporary heat as soon as they can get a gas hookup. How does the code industry address this? Vincent, would you like to have a?
Sure. Yeah,
take a go at this?
I'll do my best on this one. And I'll talk about it more from a policy perspective than a technical perspective. Lisa and Len are much more technically advanced than I am, so they can talk about the technologies. But from a policy perspective, what we're seeing, as I outlined in the presentation, is that some of these policies and regulations won't happen through the code. So Len and Lisa were very clear and careful to talk about efficiency from a cost perspective in the codes and standards. That is not always the case for regulation or ordinances. When you see some of these things pop up in these more challenging climates, for sure, with challenging costs, they might pop up as an incentive package to go here, which would maybe offset some of those costs, or it may just be a directive. And if it's a directive, it's for other reasons. It may not be for cost. And yes, it may be more expensive to go all electric in those locations, but the jurisdiction might see additional benefits such as air quality issues, safety issues, equity benefits moving forward. And we still would get more efficient systems if we went, and again, Len and Lisa talk about the efficiency of heat pumps versus gas systems. But the cost perspective, we pay for a lot of different things in this world. And in some of the cases, we're going to get different types of benefits or co-benefits out of these types of costs and of programs and incentives and regulations.
Yeah, as an example of I'm going to say how incentives change the way we build. You know, the Sears Tower or the Willis Tower, that is an electric building. That is not a gas heated building. And the only reason it's an electric building is because way back when there was some huge incentive from ComEd to make an electric building. I mean, they could have made it a gas building. So I agree. Heating a building with natural gas is always going to cost you less money. We've done a number of LEED buildings, and you put in gas-fired, chillers up on the roof, and your energy costs come way down. But it's a gas heated building, and it doesn't get to this no fossil fuel future. So yeah, the question from Minnesota is, you're right. It is going to be more expensive. It's just, how do you fit that in sort of these other regulatory structures? And maybe it's not going to be overnight. It's going to be a slow transition from gas to electric, but ultimately buildings will be moving toward electric. And I think that it's just, we need to figure out how fast that can happen and how the market can adapt to that. But it is, Vincent's right. The future is, it used to be wood, then it was oil, then it was natural gas, and the future is going to be electric eventually.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to that. Just from a project in Chicago that was looking at going all electric. They actually figured out in the end, because of the fixed costs for utility to have a natural gas hookup per unit, like really high monthly charges, $30, $40 per unit. It was actually significantly cheaper for that building to go all electric, even though it costs more the kilowatt hour costs more. But those fixed costs aren't going anywhere. And that was, $400 a year or something per tenant just to have a natural gas hookup for, actually, in this case, it was water heating and cooking. But same thing. If you can eliminate it altogether, you can allocate those savings to upfront cost and more high performance electric systems.
Okay. The next question, I'll send this one to Len. It says, for the zero code, what's the process for submitting compliance documentation? And is there any overlap with submitting for local energy codes? Is that
this might be more for Vincent. So
you want to try? Well,
yeah,
happy to.
yeah.
Vincent, do you want to take it?
Sure. We get this question a lot from local code officials. Do I need to be trained up if we adopt the zero code on understanding renewable energy procurement documentation and contracts? And the answer is pretty much no. And the reason for that is there's a whole lot of things that a building code official has to review and check off, but they don't have to necessarily be trained on. And so there are very standard contracts for renewable energy procurements that are evaluated by third parties. And so the code officials would essentially just be requiring to review those types of contracts, and they have met the third party designation. So one that's familiar with most people is the Green E certification, which is done by the Center for Resource Solutions. It's a stamp saying this is a renewable project. They have said that if a jurisdiction adopted the zero code, they would set the requirements of third party verification. They would provide that in the contracts and for the procurement development, and then all the code officials has to look for is that stamp and says that there's the 15-year contract, highlight that, good. There's this requirement, good. There's this requirement of the contract. They don't have to necessarily go into great detail. It's just another simple compliance mechanism.
Since I'm not guessing who the right person is, I'm just going to put out this question, and then you guys can fight it out. Is code a legal requirement or a target? If it's not legislation, what's the best strategy to help achieve the goals? I'm happy to go ahead.
So code is a legal requirement as it's adopted. So as I think maybe Vincent, no, maybe you said, Isaac, is we write the codes, you know, and then they get adopted by municipalities. And at that point, it becomes an ordinance. It becomes a law.
Right.
Right. And I think, Isaac, you did a great job in your introduction about talking about the variability of our United States of America on how we handle codes. And it's a mixed bag. It's all over the place. And what is interesting, and I noted in my presentation, is that the federal government does not decide this. This is a state-by-state level or a local government level. However, there are federal dollars that are tied to code development or code adoption from the feds. And that happened through the ERA funding back in 2009. That was that time?
2009.
And they try to say that, you know, if you want additional funding from the feds, you will upgrade your codes. Because there are some states in this country that don't even have an energy code. So they have a building code, yes, to make sure things don't fall down, but they don't have an energy code. And some other jurisdictions are way, way behind. We're talking about the 2021. Some of them are still back in the early 2000s or even before that. So there's a lot of variability here, but what is really the key is that the local jurisdictions or the states have to then adopt the latest standards. So that we spent a lot of time in the building community talking about pushing the thresholds of energy conservation in the codes, and we should be doing that, absolutely. The model codes are absolutely critical. But we also need to spend a lot of time just getting our local jurisdictions to adopt the latest codes, because we're way, way behind, and we're going to be way behind all of this 2.4 trillion square feet that we're going to be building across the globe if we don't get our act together. And I should also note that there are many places in the global south that don't have energy codes at all either. Where pretty much all the energy codes are in the global north except for Australia. So when we start to see this building boom in Latin America and in Africa and in Southeast Asia, if we don't get our act together in the northern hemisphere, we are really setting up the future for catastrophe, because they won't even have any energy codes at all. So we really need to be getting our own act together, getting our local jurisdictions to adopt the latest codes and standards, while folks like Glenn really push the envelope on the next code efficiency standard, and we keep ratcheting that thing down.
And the next question is actually specifically for Lisa, so this has become much easier. It says, with the 2% construction capital investment cost in 2017 and 2018, the Pennsylvania study, compared with the 2% in the positive 2% in 2016, we know that contractors, developers would be skeptical of this. Do we have any idea what the sample size for the reference data was? It says with a 2% reduction in investment, it should make more sense for developers to be going this route. Why haven't they done so already? So what's the sample size, and why do you think they haven't just all jumped on this simultaneously?
Yeah, so the sample size, I'll send a link in the chat as well, or make sure it goes out to Katie, but the sample size is just the number of projects that the PHFA funded each year, which is about 50, I think. And so the ones that they have, that's total. So only a percentage of those are the ones that met the passive building standards versus the others. So, you know, you're not looking at more than 25 in each bucket, and it's, I don't think it was half and half. I think it was much lower, probably 15-35 or something, passive house versus non. So it's a smaller number of passive building compliant buildings than regular. With the reduction, yeah, it would make more sense for people to go that route. I really think it was more of a prioritization of funds. So I think it could be done, but other developers just prioritize different things. Finishes, more expensive, I don't know, other parts of the building. So some developers just got a little more creative about it, I guess. Maybe had simpler detailing. Maybe the building wasn't as architecturally impressive. I don't know. But I think that's more of what it was. They're delivering the same number of units, or the required number of units, for a lower cost, because they prioritize where they put their development dollars. Why haven't they done it already? I wish I knew the answer to that. I'm searching for that. But I think it's a learning curve, because it did cost more upfront, and that can scare people away. But people learned, and people learned from their previous project, applied to their next project, and saved, and that's what we're finding all over. But we're continually training new people that always will be doing something for the first time, and when you do something for the first time, it costs more. It's just plain and simple. You have to learn. So we're pushing for more and more people to do this, but I can't say why everyone's not doing it.
It's a slow process to
Yeah.
get people to get comfortable.
Sure.
But as Lisa mentioned, as people practice and as people gain familiarity with systems and how to build it and how to prioritize it and how to do design intent, it becomes easier and those costs do come down. So it's a matter of doing. One additional question. It says, how are you connecting with the electric utilities? Will they have the capacity to support all of this electrification? Who wants that one?
I can say one thing about ComEd. So, I mean, the electric utilities want more electric energy use, but ComEd specifically has an incentive program for all electric buildings right now. They're giving you dollars for all electric residential buildings. So they want it. If they don't have the capacity right now to support it, they'll get it. So I wouldn't really be worried about the electric utilities. I'd be worried about the other utilities that would be pushing this away.
And you've seen in the advocacy efforts that happened in Berkeley, which is where the first natural gas ban for new construction occurred, that Pacific Gas and Electric, the largest investor in utility, was in support of the policy. And they're dual fuel, so they actually were talking about not only increasing their electric supply, but decreasing their gas supply in order to accommodate the policy. But they recognize the fossil fuel-free future as well. In addition, because electrification usually means more efficiency in itself, because we're talking about heat pump systems for the most part, is that the loads are not that much greater than what we would see. Certainly you're getting more electric load than you would gas load, but for the most part, this is not a no-brainer for the electric utilities. They can handle it. I should also note that from an emissions perspective, because of that increased efficiency, for the most part, we will see a reduction in emissions. There's this question about whether or not electrification will actually increase emissions because of how dirty the current grids are. Certainly we at Architecture 2030 are advocating that those buildings bring on their own renewables, so therefore the equation is zero. But if they, for some reason, are still pulling from more of a fossil fuel given grid, Rocky Mountain Institute did a great study that basically said it's time to electrify now from an emissions perspective everywhere. Even if we're not quite at parity, we're going to be there in the short term and really look at marginal emissions rates. So from an emissions perspective, it's saying go for it. From a utility perspective, they're saying go for it. And from a renewables perspective, pretty much all of the utilities are recognizing that there is a mandate now for them to increase their renewables, even if there's not a state policy, that there's a public demand for renewables. And so they're working to make that integration and bringing on new renewables. And if that wasn't enough, the costs of new renewable generation now have been, for renewables, has been cheaper than fossil fuels for the last number of years. We've made that split globally. So it's actually now cheaper for utilities to replace existing coal plants with new photovoltaics. That's how cheap renewables have been getting now at a grid scale. So all signs say go for it.
Okay. I have one final question from the chat at the moment, at least at the, oh, actually, they're coming in hot and heavy. Why are there, so the next question is, why are there so few water-sourced heat exchange systems in the Chicago River? There are a few that provide cooling, but none that I know of that produce both heating and cooling.
So,
Len?
So, no, that's interesting. So the majority, believe it or not, the majority of the buildings on the Chicago River do use the river as a heat sink. So the problem is they've raised the temperature of the river too much, and because all these systems are grandfathered in. So it's actually, you know, the problem with ground source or water source heat pumps, the problem is the water gets, unless the water's big enough, it gets too hot, because most of these buildings are heat rejection buildings. And so you end up heating the river up. Now, if they could send it to the lake is probably enough water that it wouldn't heat up. But the whole idea with most ground source or water source heat pumps, systems, is you can't have too much heating or too much cooling. You have to have somewhat of a balanced load. Why there's, and I think because the Chicago River is a sort of an a federal waterway, any future building is limited in what they can do. There's an existing system, you can sort of build upon that, but Any new systems are limited. But they're super efficient. I mean, water is a great conductor of energy. So, I mean, you know, there's a number of universities that have usually, well, Northwestern, that whole pond at Northwestern up in Evanston, that's a big heat sink. But it basically connects to the lake. So it's basically, their whole campus is cooled by the lake.
Okay. Are there any, I'm going to ask if there's any final questions. I think
Isaac, it looks like there is a question. I'm not sure exactly what it was referring to about, is there something like this in the work for the residential market? And
I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if that was referring to the water source heat exchange system.
If by chance it was referring to the zero code standard, I just wanted to
go for it.
Plug and say that New Buildings Institute and a few other partners championed a similar appendix to the residential standard. I'm not sure exactly the name, but it's a net zero residential code that will, all indications, I think that it did pass, so it should end up in the IECC 2021 again as well. So there will be a residential standard as well. My understanding though is that the difference between that and the zero code from commercial is that all the renewables have to be on site as opposed to this off-site procurement that I spent so much in my presentation talking about. So there will be 2 zero code appendices in the 2021 IECC as far as I understand.
I have another question here. Can the zero code only be adopted by the state if it's a non-home rule state? How can the city adopt the zero code if they are subject to the state code?
So, great question. Yeah, go ahead, Isaac.
I can take a shot at this. There are certain. It's kind of a hierarchy of three levels here. One, as you said, you noted, if it's a home rule state, then it's effectively the Wild West, and any municipality can adopt a code. There is a higher level in a number of states that prohibit. If they have a state code, they will prohibit the adoption of a different code by municipalities. And then there are a number of states in the middle in which, even though they have a state code, that kind of provides it often provides a floor, but municipalities can go higher. Those states would include, and I did not mention it in the beginning, Illinois, which allows the city of Chicago and a number of selected cities to adopt a code that's different from the state code. Colorado, Massachusetts, New York, Washington, Texas, Nevada, let's see, Oklahoma, California, Maryland. There's a number of states that have a basic code, but do allow municipalities or local jurisdictions. For example, in Maryland, it's done at a county level, to adopt a code that's not the state code. So if we want stretch codes to move forward, you either have to go to the states that allow it, a home rule state, a state that allows it, like the ones I mentioned it, or if you're in a state that does not allow it, a state like Minnesota, and I believe Michigan come to mind on this, then you actually have to adopt enabling legislation to move a stretch code forward. And that's something you just have to kind of know within the local state statutory environment.
Isaac, I have something to add to that, which is, I find this all very interesting because we're really in a new frontier when we're talking about renewable energy. In many cases, it's not even looked at as part of the energy code because the energy code is being considered as energy efficiency. And we've kind of added on-site generation as part of that efficiency package because we're not pulling from the grid as much energy because we're producing some. But this whole movement around procurement of renewables and whose jurisdiction that is, some would say that even though it is in the appendix and could be adopted as a code, it can also be adopted as an ordinance. And we've actually seen precedent for that in California, where the city of San Francisco has a requirement that now that the largest buildings in the city, existing buildings, must procure from the renewable standard from the utility. So they can either buy from the muni there, the municipal utility, or from PG&E, their green power program. They go on, they pick the green button, they pay maybe a cent kilowatt more, and they're done and they're in compliance. That's actually done through the municipal code, not through the building energy efficiency code or building energy code. So I think we're going to start to see local jurisdictions have a little bit more flexibility, perhaps, if they go outside of the code world. And it was kind of back to the electrification the conversation earlier too. So this may not be a one size fits all, and just like there's so many different home states and non-home states and local jurisdictions and counties, I think we could see a variety of adoption mechanisms to something like the zero code. That wouldn't be your energy efficiency stuff, is still stuck in the energy efficiency code world. The electrification stuff might be in an ordinance, and the renewables might be in a municipal code. I'm not saying it's the cleanest way that we handle all of these disparate policies, but it is some way to move forward towards net zero across the board. So maybe we should call the next webinar net zero policies rather than net zero codes, if that's the direction things go.
Fair enough. I'm going to add one more. There's one, it's 3:57, so we have one time for one more question. And this is, as regards the move to all electric and particularly renewables, what are your thoughts on the need to provide electric baseload backup for when renewables are not, quote unquote, in action?
I mean, so most of these net zero buildings, if not all of them, are using the grid essentially as a battery or as a backup. So the grid will remain there, and yes, there's baseload that'll need to be covered when the sun goes down or the wind's not blowing. But there's also design considerations that you can use to help your building be more flexible to respond to that, or to utilize your renewables a little bit better and take a little bit of that load off of the grid when your on-site renewables are not in action. I'm not sure if I fully answered that, but
it's okay. You're running out of time anyway, so
yeah, I'm not sure what scale we're looking here.
Well, in general, like, there's the base load, in talking to some of the guys at the Edison Institute, the base load right now is being satisfied by the existing coal plants, and which they don't want to turn off. You don't want to turn a coal plant off, and a nuclear plant. You don't want to turn it off. So at least for the foreseeable future, within the next 20 years, the base load is sort of being handled by that. And it's really, I think the incentive for this is any new electricity that's added to the grid is got to be renewable, right? And then we'll slowly phase out that base load, and we will, at that point, we'll have solved the battery storage problem and the sort of the nighttime wind turbine or the nighttime solar problem. But I mean, it's not, I don't have an answer for it today, but I do know we're covered at least for the next probably 20 years with just what we have. Because remember, we get these buildings efficient, that EUI was going down from 30 to 12. Right? I mean, so you're using half as much energy. So you don't need, as Lisa said, you don't need as much as we do now because we're using less. So we have plenty of capacity within the grid.
And I see Katie joining us, so I will switch this over to her.
Oh, I'm popping in. You can give your last question, Isaac, your final thoughts question.
Okay, so I have really one final question for all three panelists, and that is, well, really more, is there anything that you would like to add? Any final thoughts? Any one point that you would like to emphasize as we finish up this this webinar that you haven't felt you've covered, or that a point that really you were anxious?
So I'll go. I think that, you know, architects are suited for this. That this is a design. Ultimately, this is a huge design problem that we can solve. And if we build a narrative with our clients that this is a good thing, then, you know, that's just added value, and, you know, we can be at the center of the solution.
I'll just say, and I made this point earlier, although I think I can say it better now, this is not about if this is going to happen. This is about when. And I mean that with all sincerity, and it may not be 3 years from now or this next code cycle, and it may not be 6, it may be in 10 years, but at some point, our grids are going to be our buildings are going to be electric, our grids are going to be clean, and the faster that you get up to speed on this, either at a jurisdictional level and advocate for it and work out all the kinks, or from a technical level or a design level, the better you're going to be in the marketplace.
Okay.
I think you guys summed it up just perfectly. We can end on that. Yeah.
All All right, I will switch it back over to Katie then to
Great.
finish up the webinar.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Isaac, for hosting and gathering this program together. Thank you, Len, Vincent, and Lisa for sharing all of your expertise with us today and answering all of the questions that were coming in hot in the Q&A. And, you know, I know this is a topic that's definitely on everyone's mind and is coming up more and more in discussion. So we really appreciate you kind of level setting this for everybody, getting everyone a good understanding of what's out there. And we look forward to more presentations to build upon this. So thank you again. Thanks everyone for joining. We will send out a follow-up email before the end of the week with the links that have been shared in the chat today, a recording and a PDF of the presentation so you can take a closer look. Thank you again and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.